Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. We're now at Senator Cassidy.
Hey, thank you. I'll address my first question to Ms. Shaw and Mr. Wessel. So we put these negotiations in which we seek to have a decarbonization of an economy, and we seek to have some sort of labor standard so that our folks are not competing against slave labor. That's good. But the cost of compliance, or the cost of not using slave labor, increased your costs relative to a product made in China, for example. I spoke to one fellow, a company I was formerly with, made the decision to put their new plant, manufacturing plant in China, because they didn't enforce their SOx and NOx scrubbers. The return on investment would be 18% there as opposed to 8% elsewhere, where they would have to turn on SOx and NOx scrubbers. In a sense, these requirements incentivize the movement of industry to China, where they don't enforce these standards. So my point is, how do we avoid a race to bottom? Or should there be some sort of offset, a border offset for using slave labor, or for polluting the common areas of the ocean and of the sky with that which elsewhere we're attempting to regulate down? Put differently, if we negotiate a trade agreement of which China is not part of, and which the participants must have the cost of compliance with labor and environmental regulations, are we not just building in an advantage for China? Ms. Shaw, you first, please.
Sure. Having diverse and resilient supply chains is critical. Part of the challenges that you're talking about are that where it's cheaper to produce, that's where companies will go. But that's not the most effective way to do business. We have to incentivize companies to do business in a strong and resilient Indo-Pacific region where we do have high labor standards. We do have high environmental standards.
Because how do you incent it? Because there's a higher cost of doing business where you have those standards and a lower cost where you do not.
Market access. You get preferential trade treatment, lower duties if you meet certain standards and comply with certain provisions of the trade.
So implicit in what you just said is that there should be an elevated duty on those who do not meet some standard when it comes to the environment, labor, or perhaps other factors.
Or a lower duty for those that do.
Okay, and Mr. Wessel?
I think first of all, thank you for the question. I think in the terms of carbon intensity, there is a path forward. The U.S. and the EU, as part of their 232 arrangement, included a provision on a global arrangement to deal with carbon intensity as one component. And I think one of the things that's on the table there is a border adjustment measure that would address the lax environmental enforcement by China and other countries in terms of what they're exporting. For each ton of steel, as I understand it, China has 3 times more carbon intensity per ton than the U.S. We can't allow that to be a competitive advantage, and we need to deal with that with border measures. I expect as part of IPEF and the Indo-Pacific strategy that carbon intensity can be dealt with in a similar way. For the question of forced labor, similarly, we can have border measures. We do have some with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which is now going through the regulatory scrub. We've seen countries across the globe condemn China's actions in Xinjiang, calling them genocide. And we need to find a way to make sure that that is not a competitive advantage and is dealt with effectively among allied nations.
Would you suggest that if we are going to have a trade agreement with other countries in which we expect them to comply with standards such as this, that part of that trade agreement would have to have a border adjustment so that of some sort for these factors we're discussing to avoid that incentivization of companies to move to China?
I think in terms of carbon intensity, that's going to be on the table. In terms of forced labor, I think we need to trace supply chains to make sure that those products, either directly or, for example, polysilicon being utilized in solar arrays, et cetera, that those products do not make their way into the U.S. By doing that, we create the incentive for the Indo-Pac countries and others to disengage from Chinese supply chains that spoil the environment and abuse workers' rights.
I see. So wherever that supply chain flowed through, if you just wanted to take it through a third country, you would somehow defeat that initiative. Let me save a little bit of time.
Yes.
Ms. Lawrenson, may I ask you a quick question, please? I got a lot of shrimpers, and they're competing against what they allege is dumped shrimp coming from India. Now, I think your testimony points out that India has really high import tariffs, and yet we bless them with pretty low import tariffs on our side. If you will, it tilts the playing field. How do I go back to my shrimpers and defend that?
Right. Well, it's always a challenge, right? And India is a particularly protectionist market when it comes to food, seafood, and agricultural products. But this is where actually negotiating on tariffs and market access to level the playing field would be particularly important, either directly and bilaterally with India or through the IPEF. That's how you deal with it. Obviously, the U.S. already has countervailing duty and anti-dumping laws, which can help on the import side. But again, I would promote that having that balanced playing field in both markets can be of benefit.
I yield. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. Senator Hassan's next, and she has been very patient